At 55, Marion Doyle stood in a black funeral dress at the edge of a cranberry bog, everyone in Harrow's Point called poisoned. The mud was dark as coal. The water had a red, sickly shine. The old harvesting shed leaned sideways in the Atlantic fog, its roof torn open by years of storms. Behind her, men from town stood near their trucks with their hands in their coat pockets, trying not to laugh too loudly. Her husband, Deputy Thomas Doyle, had been buried only 3 days earlier. The official story was simple: a hunting accident, a wet November morning, one shot in the trees, and a good man gone before anyone could reach him. Then the will was read. Thomas had not left Marion the house they had shared for 27 years. He had not left her land anyone wanted. He had left her this ruined cranberry bog, 12 acres of sour water, dead vines, and black mud beside the salt marsh. One banker told her she would be lucky to sell it for the price of scrap lumber. But what nobody knew was that beneath the drainage gate, sealed in a place no honest person would think to look, Thomas Doyle had hidden the final case of his life. And before Marion was done with that mud, the town that laughed at her would learn why her husband had really died. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. If stories about quiet people, forgotten places, and the truth buried beneath old soil mean something to you, hit the like button and subscribe, because Marion's story was only beginning. Marion had learned early that some places kept secrets better than people did. She was born in a narrow gray house above a bait shop, where the wind from the Maine coast rattled the windows hard enough to wake a child before sunrise. Her father mended lobster traps when his hands were steady and drank when they were not. Her mother cleaned rooms at the Harbor Rest Inn and taught Marion how to fold sheets so tight a quarter could bounce off the cotton. There was never much money in that house, but there were always lists. Her mother kept them on torn envelopes, on backs of church bulletins, on brown paper bags flattened against the kitchen table. Flour, lamp oil, soap, rent, doctor, coal. Every penny had a place. Every debt had a name. Every promise, her mother used to say, should be written down before the person making it found a way to forget. Marion was 9 the first time she understood what that meant. A man from the bank came to the bait shop one cold March morning and told her father that a payment had gone missing. Her father swore he had made it. The man smiled like he had heard that story too many times before. Marion watched her father search every drawer, every coffee tin, every coat pocket, growing smaller with each place he looked. Then her mother opened a recipe book and took out a folded receipt, thin as onion skin. The man's smile disappeared. That day, Marion learned that paper could be stronger than shouting. A quiet woman with the right proof could stop a powerful man in the middle of his sentence. She never forgot it. By the time Marion was grown, she could read a room by what people avoided saying. She noticed when a man promised soon, but never gave a date. She noticed when a clerk slid one paper beneath another. She noticed when a widow signed a document while someone younger stood too close behind her shoulder. No one in Harrow's Point called Marion clever. They called her careful, quiet, plain. Thomas Doyle's wife, but Thomas knew better. After he became a deputy sheriff, he began bringing old case folders home in cardboard boxes with bent corners and rusted clips. Boundary complaints, missing deeds, notes from fishermen who said their slips had been taken, reports from elderly farmers who insisted their signatures had been forged. At night, Thomas spread those papers across the kitchen table. Marion made tea, sat beside him, and put the chaos into order. Names in one pile, dates in another. Maps beside receipts. Witness statements matched with photographs. Loose scraps tucked into envelopes, each one labeled in her steady hand. "You see what other people hurry past," Thomas told her once. After that, Marion kept a small blue notebook in her apron pocket. She wrote down facts, not gossip, dates, weather, times, names, license plates, the price of heating oil, the day a neighbor moved away. She never thought those notes would matter, not until Thomas came home one evening, with mud on his boots, salt wind in his coat, and fear hidden behind his eyes. The week before Thomas died, Marion began to feel the town closing around them. People stopped speaking when she entered the general store. The young teller at North Coast Bank lowered her voice whenever Marion asked about their mortgage. At church, Mrs. Harrow touched Marion's arm with a smile too soft to be kind and said, "You must be tired, dear. Thomas does bring trouble home with him." That night, Thomas sat at the kitchen table without removing his coat. Rain tapped against the window. His deputy hat rested beside a stack of folders, but he kept one hand on top of the papers, as if the wind might reach inside the house and take them. "If anything happens," he said, "don't trust the first story they give you." Marion looked up from her blue notebook. "What kind of thing is that to say?" Thomas tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. He slid a small brass key across the table. It was dark with age, tied to a strip of faded red cloth. "Keep this somewhere safe," he said. 3 mornings later, men found him in the woods beyond Black Spruce Road. By noon, the sheriff called it an accident. By evening, the Harrow family sent flowers, and by the end of the week, Marion Doyle understood that grief was not the only thing waiting for her. Something else was coming, quietly, with paperwork. For 27 years, Marion and Thomas Doyle had lived in a white clapboard house at the end of Gull Street, close enough to the harbor that salt gathered on the windows after every storm. It was not a grand house. The porch sagged on one side. The upstairs bedroom stayed cold through January. The kitchen floor dipped near the stove where years of wet boots had softened the boards. But Marion loved it, because every mark in that house belonged to a life she understood. She had planted lavender beside the front steps because Thomas liked the smell when he came home late. She had sewn the first curtains herself during a winter when they could not afford new ones. She had painted the pantry shelves blue after her mother died, because grief had made everything else feel gray. They had no children. For years, people asked why. Then, slowly, they stopped. Marion learned to smile in a way that closed the subject gently. Thomas never made her feel empty because of it. On cold nights, he would put another log in the stove and say, "Some homes are still full, even without noise." That was the sentence Marion remembered most after the funeral, when the house became too quiet to bear. Thomas had been a steady man. He was not loud, not proud, not careless with power. As a deputy sheriff, he changed tires for strangers, checked on widows after storms, and listened to people who had already been ignored by everyone else. That was why the poor trusted him. It was also why the powerful did not. In his final months, Thomas began coming home later. He washed his boots outside instead of leaving them by the door. He stopped spreading case folders across the kitchen table when anyone might visit. Once, when a black truck slowed outside their house after dark, he crossed the room and turned off the kitchen lamp. "Saving oil," he said. Marion did not argue. She simply wrote it down. October 3. Black truck, outside house. 8:40 p.m. That was what she did. She wrote things down. Dates, weather, names, odd silences, small changes in people who thought no one was watching. The changes were everywhere now. At the bank, the young teller would not meet Marion's eyes. At church, Mrs. Harrow touched Marion's sleeve and said, "Thomas does carry heavy things home, doesn't he?" At the general store, men who had once greeted her by name suddenly became interested in the shelves. Harrow's Point had always belonged, in some way, to the Harrow family. Their name was carved above the library door. Their money had repaired the church roof. Their cannery had employed half the town before it closed. Edmund Harrow, the current head of the family, wore fine wool coats and spoke softly enough to make threats sound polite. Most people stepped aside when Edmund entered a room. Thomas did not. The trouble began with small complaints. A fisherman named Peter Lyle said his dock rights had been transferred without his signature. An elderly couple on Marsh Road received notice that a strip of their land now belonged to Harrow Development. A widow named Celia Brand brought in an old deed her husband had kept in a Bible, only to be told the town records showed something different. Each case looked separate. Thomas believed they were not. At night, he brought home copies of deeds, faded maps, tax notices, photographs, and witness statements. Marion made tea and helped him sort them. Names in one pile, dates in another, maps beside receipts, families arranged by parcel number and year. Slowly, a pattern appeared. Land near the marsh, land near old bog roads, land owned by widows, fishermen, aging farmers, and families too poor to hire lawyers. Pieces taken quietly, one paper at a time. Thomas did not say the word crime at first. Then one night, after midnight, he sat across from Marion at the kitchen table and whispered it. The word did not sound like anger. It sounded like grief. 2 days before he died, Thomas came home with mud on his knees and a tear in his coat sleeve. He would not say where he had been. He only asked Marion for an envelope, wrapped something flat in brown paper, and stood by the stove as if trying to warm a cold that had gone deeper than skin. "Thomas," Marion said, "are you in danger?" He looked at her for a long moment. "If I am," he said, "then I was right." After his death, the town gave Marion flowers, casseroles, sympathy cards, and lies. They said it was a hunting accident. They said the woods were wet. They said Thomas had been alone. Sheriff Nolan told her, with one heavy hand on her shoulder, "Best thing now is to let the dead rest." But Marion had seen the fear in her husband's eyes. She had written down the truck, the dates, the names, the way people looked away. She knew what the sheriff was really asking. He was not asking her to grieve. He was asking her to stop remembering. The first paper arrived 6 days after the funeral. It came in a white envelope from North Coast Bank, folded with a neatness that felt almost cruel. Marion found it pushed through the brass slot when she came home from Thomas's grave, her shoes still carrying damp cemetery soil. She set it on the kitchen table and opened it with the same knife she used for bread. The words inside were ordinary enough. Outstanding balance. Failure to satisfy terms. Review of collateral. Scheduled appointment. But beneath the language was the sentence every widow understands without needing a lawyer. The house was not safe. Marion read the notice twice, then placed it beside her blue notebook. Thomas had always handled the mortgage payments, not because Marion could not, but because the bank liked seeing his signature. Still, she knew their life had been careful, not rich, never rich, but careful. She pulled the receipt box from the pantry shelf and spread the papers across the table. Payment slips, tax bills, insurance letters, notes in Thomas's square handwriting. There was no gap large enough to explain the bank's tone. So the next morning, Marion put on her gray coat and walked to North Coast Bank. Inside, the young teller's face tightened when Marion gave her name. A few minutes later, she was led to the office of Mr. Voss, the bank manager, who sat behind a polished desk with 2 framed photographs of sailboats on the wall. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I'm afraid there are complications regarding the property on Gull Street. It is my home." His mouth made a small, practiced shape. Not sympathy, not quite a smile. "The house was attached to certain obligations your husband entered into before his death." Marion placed her receipts on the desk. "These are payments. Yes, but they do not address the full matter." "What full matter?" Mr. Voss opened a folder and turned 2 sheets toward her. The top page showed Thomas's signature. At least, it looked like Thomas's signature to someone who had not watched him write grocery lists, police reports, and notes on scrap paper for 27 years. Marion did not touch it. "That is not his hand," she said. Mr. Voss blinked once. "I would be careful with accusations. I am being careful. That is why I said it plainly." The room went still. He took the papers back and told her the matter would proceed through proper channels. She asked for copies. He said the bank could not release them. Marion wrote that down while he watched. When she stood to leave, he cleared his throat. "There may be a way to avoid public difficulty. Mr. Harrow has expressed interest in resolving certain distressed properties in town. Quietly, generously. My husband is dead less than a week. Which is why I urge you not to make this harder on yourself." By the time Marion reached Gull Street, a county notice had been tacked to her front porch. She stood beneath it with her grocery bag hanging from one hand and read her life reduced to deadlines. Vacate, review, transfer, failure to comply. The words did not shout. They did not need to. They were written in the language of doors closing. That afternoon, Sheriff Nolan came by in the brown jacket he wore when he wanted to appear neighborly. He stayed on the porch. "Marion," he said, "nobody wants trouble. That seems to be what people say right before they bring it." His eyes moved past her into the house. toward the kitchen table where Thomas's folders used to sit. "You should let the lawyers handle the papers." "What lawyers?" He sighed. "Thomas left a will. It will be read Friday. After that, things may be clearer." "They are clear enough." "No," Nolan said softly. "They are not." On Friday, Marion sat in the office of Mr. Baird, the town attorney. Edmund Harrow was there, though no one explained why. So was Mr. Voss, with his folder closed on his lap. Mr. Baird read the will in a dry voice. Thomas left his tools to a cousin in Portland, his deputy hat and personal effects to Marion, his small savings, after debts, to Marion. Then Mr. Baird paused. "And to my wife, Marion Doyle, I leave full claim and responsibility for the 12-acre cranberry bog off Salt Reed Road, including the drainage shed, water access, and any contents legally belonging to said property." Silence filled the room. Then Edmund Harrow laughed softly. "The poisoned bog," he said. Marion knew the place. Everyone knew it. A dead stretch of sour water and black mud beyond the marsh, abandoned after the vines failed and the drainage channels fouled. Children dared one another to run near it. Hunters avoided it. No buyer had touched it in years. When the reading ended, Mr. Baird slid a deed toward her. "It is yours," he said, as if apologizing. Marion looked at the paper, then at the men watching her. They expected shame, confusion, maybe tears. Instead, she remembered Thomas sliding the brass key across the kitchen table. "Keep this somewhere safe." Her fingers closed around the deed. "What about my house?" she asked. Mr. Voss answered, "The bank will proceed." Edmund Harrow leaned forward, silver hair bright in the window light. "I could take the bog off your hands, Mrs. Doyle. Save you the taxes. Save you the embarrassment." "For how much?" $1, he said. "More than it's worth." Marion folded the deed once and placed it inside her purse beside the blue notebook. "No," she said. The men stared as if the chair had spoken. By sundown, she had packed what she could carry. Thomas's hat, her mother's receipt box, 2 blankets, the brass key, the blue notebook, a kettle, one framed photograph of Thomas standing on the harbor pier with his hand raised against the wind. She left the lavender by the steps. She could not bear to dig it up. When she closed the front door, she did not know whether she would ever open it again. Fog rolled in from the harbor. Down the street, curtains shifted as neighbors watched. Marion lifted her suitcase, placed Thomas's hat carefully on top of the box in her cart, and turned toward Salt Reed Road. She had been given the one place nobody wanted, so she went there. Salt Reed Road began where the good pavement ended. Marion had walked it only twice in her life. Both times years ago, both times in daylight, and both times with Thomas beside her. Back then, the road had seemed like nothing more than a forgotten strip of gravel running toward the marsh. Now, with her suitcase in one hand and the small cart rattling behind her, it felt like a sentence being carried out. The harbor disappeared first, then the houses, then the street lamps. Fog moved low over the road, dragging itself through the weeds and broken fences. The air smelled of salt, rotting reeds, and cold mud. Somewhere beyond the gray, gulls cried over the flats, their voices sharp and lonely. Marion kept walking. Her black funeral shoes were not made for gravel. By the first mile, the backs of her heels were rubbed raw. By the second, the wheels of the cart had picked up so much wet sand that every turn made a scraping sound. She stopped twice to adjust the rope around the boxes. Each time she looked back, Harrow's Point seemed smaller behind her, as if the town were pleased to let the fog swallow her whole. A truck passed once. It slowed when it reached her. Marion did not turn her head. She kept both hands on the cart handle and watched the road ahead. The truck idled beside her for a moment, close enough that she could smell tobacco through the open window. Then a man laughed. "Wrong way, Mrs. Doyle," he called. "Nothing alive out there." The truck rolled on, tires spitting gravel into the ditch. Marion waited until the engine faded before she moved again. Nothing alive. That was what people said about the bog. They said the water had turned bad after the old drainage system failed. They said the vines had gone black from disease. They said animals would not drink there, and birds avoided it. They said Thomas had bought it years ago for back taxes because he felt sorry for ruined things. Marion had never understood that purchase. When she had asked him about it, Thomas had only said, "Some land remembers more than people do." At the time, she thought he meant history. Now she wondered if he had meant evidence. The brass key hung beneath her dress on a string around her neck. With each step, it tapped softly against her chest. Tap, 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 like a second heart that belonged not to her body, but to whatever Thomas had left unfinished. Rain began near the 3rd mile. Not heavy rain, just a cold coastal mist that thickened until her hair clung to her temples and the shoulders of her coat darkened. The road dipped toward the marsh. Pools gathered in the ruts, reflecting a sky with no color in it. Marion's cart caught on a stone. The suitcase slid sideways. Thomas's hat nearly fell into the mud. She grabbed it just in time. For a moment, she stood there with the hat pressed against her chest, breathing hard. The brim still held the faint shape of Thomas's hands. She could see him putting it on before leaving for work, checking the stove, kissing her cheek, saying he would be back before supper. He had not come back. The thought nearly bent her in half. But grief had no place to sit on that road. There was no chair, no warm kitchen, no lavender steps, no table where she could place her head in her arms. There was only the road, the rain, the cart, and the place nobody wanted, waiting somewhere ahead. So Marion set the hat carefully back on top of the box and kept walking. Salt Reed Road narrowed after the old fish-smoking shed. The gravel turned to packed dirt, then to twin tracks pressed into marsh grass. On either side, reeds rose taller than her shoulders, whispering against one another in the wind. The world smelled wetter here, older. Water moved unseen beneath the grass with small sucking sounds. Then she saw the first cranberry vine. It crawled across the ditch like a thin red vein. A few yards later, another. Then the land opened. The bog lay before her in the fog. Low and wide and still, 12 acres. Even in the dim light, Marion could see how sick it was. The beds were uneven, some sunken under dark water, others crusted with dead vines and gray moss. The narrow wooden walkways had broken in several places, leaving jagged boards over black channels. Rusted pipes rose from the mud like bones. At the far end, the harvesting shed leaned toward the marsh. One wall bowed, the roof torn open, the door hanging from a single hinge. No smoke, no light, no sound except wind pushing through reeds and the slow drip of rain from rotten wood. Marion stood at the edge of it and understood why the men had laughed. It did not look like property. It looked like punishment. The cart wheels sank the moment she pulled them off the road. Mud grabbed at the rubber and held. She pulled harder. One wheel turned, then stopped. Her suitcase tilted. The receipt box slid forward. "No," she whispered. She set her shoulder against the cart and pushed. The mud sucked at her shoes. Cold water seeped through the seams. Her breath came out in short white clouds. Inch by inch, she dragged the cart toward the shed, stopping whenever a board cracked underfoot or the ground shifted beneath her weight. Halfway there, she slipped. One knee went into the mud. Her hand plunged wrist-deep into cold water. For several seconds, Marion stayed like that, bowed in the poisoned bog, while rain gathered on the back of her neck. Behind her was a town that had no use for her. Before her was a ruined place that had no reason to welcome her. Then her fingers touched something solid beneath the water. A buried plank. Not rotten, not loose, placed. She looked down, but the water was too dark to see through. Marion slowly pulled her hand free. Black mud clung to her fingers. A thin red stain moved across the surface of the water, spreading like smoke. She did not know what she had touched. Not yet, but for the first time since leaving Gull Street, Marion felt something other than grief. She felt the small, sharp edge of suspicion. The shed door banged once in the wind. Marion rose, wiped her muddy hand on her coat, and pulled the cart the rest of the way across the bog. The harvesting shed smelled of old water, mouse droppings, rusted metal, and wood that had been wet too many times to remember being dry. Marion pushed the door open with her shoulder. It groaned, then struck the inside wall with a hollow bang that startled a gull from the roof. The bird lifted into the fog, screaming as if offended that any living thing had entered. Inside, the shed was worse than it looked from the road. One corner of the roof had collapsed, leaving a jagged opening where rain fell straight through onto the dirt floor. Nets hung from nails like dead skin. A rusted cranberry scoop leaned against the wall. Old wooden crates had softened at the bottom and spread apart in layers. A cracked oil lamp sat on a shelf beside a row of empty jars filled with dust. Marion stood in the doorway, holding Thomas's hat against her chest. "This is what you left me," she whispered. The words sounded cruel in the empty shed, and she regretted them the moment they left her mouth. Thomas had loved her. She knew that with the same certainty, she knew the shape of his handwriting and the sound of his steps on their porch. If he had left her this place, there was a reason, but reason did not warm a room. It did not dry a coat or lift a suitcase from mud. She set the hat on the least broken crate she could find, then began to work. First, she cleared a place near the back wall where the roof still held. She dragged aside wet rope, broken baskets, and a stack of warped boards. The floor there was not dry, but it was higher than the rest. She spread one blanket over the boards and folded the other into a roll for a pillow. Then she checked the walls. The west wall bowed outward, but it had not split. The north wall had gaps wide enough for wind to cut through. Marion found scraps of old canvas under a workbench and nailed them over the worst openings with a stone, because the shed had no hammer in sight. Every nail took effort. Her fingers were cold. Her wrists ached. Mud had dried along the hem of her black dress in stiff patches. More than once, she missed the nail and struck her thumb hard enough to bring tears to her eyes. She did not stop. A woman could cry and work at the same time. Her mother had taught her that, without ever saying the words. By late afternoon, the shed held a corner that almost resembled shelter. Almost. Marion unpacked the kettle, the receipt box, and the blue notebook. She placed Thomas's photograph on a shelf between two empty jars. In the picture, he stood on the harbor pier, one hand raised against the wind, his expression caught between seriousness and laughter. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned the photograph slightly away, not because she loved him less, because she could not bear for him to watch her like this. Hunger came next. Marion had brought half a loaf of bread, 2 apples, a small wedge of cheese, and a tin of tea. She ate one apple slowly, standing near the doorway while rain blurred the bog outside. The fruit tasted bruised and sweet. She saved the core, then laughed once at herself for thinking like someone who still had a compost pile. The laugh broke too quickly. When darkness thickened, the cold entered the shed as if it owned the place. Marion searched for dry wood and found none on the floor. Everything there had soaked up the bog's damp breath. She moved to the workbench and opened the drawers one by one. The first held mouse nests. The second held rusted screws, a broken file, and 2 bent hooks. The third stuck halfway. Marion pulled. It did not move. She set her jaw, braced one knee against the bench, and pulled harder. The drawer came free with a sharp crack, spilling its contents across the floor. A small hammer, a bundle of waxed matches, 3 candles wrapped in oilcloth. For a moment, Marion only stared. Small hope does not always arrive as a miracle. Sometimes, it is only a match that has stayed dry, because someone, years ago, had the sense to wrap it well. She lit one candle and set it inside a jar. The weak yellow light filled the shed with trembling shadows. The place still looked ruined, but less empty now. The tools on the wall gained shape. The jars shone faintly. Thomas's photograph became a pale rectangle on the shelf. Marion found an old iron stove in the back corner beneath a pile of burlap sacks. Its pipe was crooked, but still connected through the roof. She cleared the sacks away, checked the inside with the candle, and found it packed with old ash and a swallow's nest. It took nearly an hour to clean it. She used a broken scoop as a shovel and carried ash outside in a crate. The wind blew some of it back into her face. By the time the stove was clear, her hands were black, her dress was streaked, and her lungs burned from dust. There was still no dry wood. Then she remembered the crates. The ones with rotten bottoms were useless, but a few boards near the top had stayed hard. She broke them with the hammer, fed the splinters into the stove, and struck a match. The first flame died. The second curled, caught, and climbed. Marion knelt in front of the stove as if before an altar. Warmth did not come all at once. It gathered slowly, one thin breath at a time. The iron clicked. Smoke shivered up the pipe. The shed began to smell less like rot and more like burned cedar, old ash, and survival. Only then did Marion allow herself to sit. Outside, the bog disappeared into night. Rain tapped the roof and dripped through the open corner into a bucket she had placed beneath the leak. Every few minutes, something moved in the reeds. A frog, a bird, a piece of loose metal. She told herself each sound had a simple explanation. Still, she kept the hammer beside her blanket. Before sleeping, Marion opened her blue notebook and wrote by candlelight. First night at Salt Reed Bog. Shed unsafe but usable. Stove works. Matches found in drawer. Water outside dark red. Buried plank felt near West Channel. Key still with me. She paused, listening to the rain. Then she added, Thomas did not leave this place by accident. The sentence frightened her after she wrote it. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her coat for safekeeping. Then she lay down on the blanket with her shoes still on, Thomas's hat beside her, the hammer within reach, and the brass key resting cold against her chest. For a long time, Marion did not sleep. She watched the stove glow through the cracks in its iron door. She listened to the wind press against the patched canvas. She smelled mud, smoke, salt, and old wood. It was not home, not yet. It was broken, wet, and unwanted. But it had given her a flame, and on that first night, with the whole town behind her and the poisoned bog breathing in the dark beyond the shed, a flame was enough. Morning came gray and low. With fog pressed against the shed windows so thickly, Marion could not see the far side of the bog. For a few seconds after waking, she forgot where she was. Then the smell returned. Mud, ash, damp wood, salt marsh. She opened her eyes to the crooked stove, Thomas's hat beside her blanket, and the candle burned down inside its jar. Her back hurt from the boards. Her thumb throbbed from the nail she had missed the night before. But the shed had not fallen down, and a little warmth still clung to the iron stove. That counted. Marion drank smoky tea, put the blue notebook in her coat pocket, and stepped outside. In daylight, the bog looked even sicker. The water was not only red from old cranberry vines, it carried a dark film beneath the color, as if something had been stirred up and never settled. Dead runners floated in tangles. Rusted pipes rose from the mud, disappeared, then appeared again at wrong angles. Marion stood still and looked. That was what Thomas had trusted her to do. Not rush. Not guess. Look. The beds nearest the shed were clearly abandoned. But the west channel, where her hand had touched the solid plank in the rain, was different. The reeds around it had been cut back, not recently, but not years ago either. Someone had been there. She crossed the broken walkway slowly, testing each board with the hammer, before trusting her weight to it. At the west channel, she knelt, rolled up her sleeve, and reached into the water. Cold closed around her wrist. Her fingers found mud first, then roots, then wood. She cleared along the edge and felt another board fitted beside it. Not driftwood. Not wreckage from the shed. A cover. Marion sat back on her heels and wrote it down. West Channel. Submerged plank cover. Placed by hand. The cover ran toward the old drainage gate at the marsh edge. From a distance, the gate looked like ruined boards and rusted iron. Up close, she saw a wheel handle, 2 orange hinges, and a chain disappearing into black mud. Then she saw the lock. A brass lock hung low against the frame, dark with weather but still whole. Marion touched the key beneath her dress. The small brass key Thomas had given her was tied to a faded strip of red cloth. She pulled it free, knelt in the mud, and tried it in the lock. It did not fit. She tried again, slowly, turning it by feel. Nothing. For a moment, disappointment passed through her so sharply she almost laughed. Of course, Thomas would not make it easy. He had known who might come looking. He had known the first obvious lock would be the first place anyone tried. She put the key back beneath her collar and studied the gate. That was when she noticed the marks. 3 short cuts had been carved into the lower beam, nearly hidden by mud stain. Beside them was a 4th mark, longer and slanted. Below it were 2 small letters. T. T. Marian stopped breathing. Thomas Doyle. The letters were small, but she knew the shape of his D, flat-backed and sharp at the top, the same way he wrote it on grocery lists and case envelopes. He had been here. Not long ago. She copied the marks into her notebook with fingers that did not feel steady. 3 cuts, 1 slant, T, D, on drainage gate. Only then did she see the splintered hole in the side of the frame. It was about the width of her thumb, with pale raw wood around the edge, where rain had not yet darkened it. At first she told herself it was rot. Then she touched it. The edges were too sharp. She had seen enough of Thomas's old reports to know what a bullet could do to wood. Marian stepped back so quickly her heel slid in the mud. The official story placed Thomas in the woods beyond Black Spruce Road, alone, hunting, careless for 1 fatal second. But Thomas had marked this gate. This damaged gate. This hidden gate on a poisoned bog no one was supposed to want. The story was already broken. Wind moved through the reeds behind her. Marian turned, but saw only fog, black grass, and the empty road beyond. Still, the skin between her shoulders tightened. She knelt again and pushed both hands along the submerged cover, clearing mud 1 slow handful at a time. Near the base of the gate, her fingers found iron, not the chain, a handle. It lay flat beneath the water, hidden under the planks, positioned where no passerby would see it. Marian wrapped both hands around it and pulled. Nothing. She planted 1 knee deeper in the mud and pulled again. This time something shifted below the gate with a low wooden groan. Bubbles rose through the red water. A smell came up with them, sour and metallic, like a closed room opened after many years. Then a thin stream of darker water slipped between 2 boards. In it floated a scrap of oilcloth, black, folded tight, and tied with red thread, the same color as the strip on Thomas's key. Marian picked it up with 2 muddy fingers. She did not open it there. The fog felt too close. The reeds made too many small sounds. And now she understood that the bog was not only a place Thomas had left behind, it was a place someone might still be watching. Holding the wet oilcloth against her coat, Marian walked back toward the shed. Behind her, the drainage gate settled again with a soft, hollow knock. She did not know what was inside the oilcloth yet. She only knew Thomas had left her a sentence in mud, wood, iron, and red thread. And she had just read the first word. Marian closed the shed door and dropped the latch with shaking fingers. For a moment, she stood with her back against the wood, listening. Rain ticked softly through the broken roof. The stove gave off 1 faint breath of yesterday's heat. Outside, the reeds whispered. And farther off, something creaked at the drainage gate. No footsteps. No engine. Still, she waited. Only when the silence stayed ordinary did she move to the workbench and set the folded oilcloth beneath the candle jar. Mud ran from it in thin black lines. The red thread around it was tied in a square knot. Thomas's kind of knot, neat and practical, made to hold even when wet. Marian touched it once before untying it. "Thomas," she whispered, "what did you do?" Inside the oilcloth was not a letter. It was a strip of map, torn from a larger survey page, marked in pencil. 3 short lines, 1 slanted line, a small circle drawn near the drainage gate. Beside it, in Thomas's hand, were 2 words, "Not gate." Below, Marian sat slowly on the crate. The key at her chest seemed to grow colder. She spread the map beside her notebook and studied it the way she had studied case files at the kitchen table. The torn edge cut through the name of the property, but she could see enough. Salt Reed Bog, West Channel, Old Spillway, Drain Box. Below, the word did not mean under the gate itself. Thomas would have written under if he meant under. Below meant lower in the system. Downstream, past the visible boards. Somewhere beneath the flow, Marian took the candle, the hammer, and a rusted pry bar she had found beneath the bench. Then she returned to the drainage gate. This time, she did not approach from the walkway. She followed the channel along the marsh side, moving slowly through reeds that slapped wet against her coat. The ground dipped near the spillway. Brackish water seeped around her shoes. Twice, she nearly sank past her ankles and had to grab blackberry canes to steady herself. Below the gate, hidden behind a curtain of reeds, she found a square wooden hatch set into the bank. It was almost invisible. Mud covered the edges. Grass had grown over one side. A person standing above would see only marsh. But Thomas had known where to look. And now Marion did too. In the center of the hatch was a small brass plate with a keyhole. Marion pulled the key from beneath her dress. This time, it fit. The lock resisted at first. She turned gently, then harder. Something clicked deep in the wood. The sound was small, but it moved through her like thunder. She slid the pry bar beneath the hatch and lifted. The wood came up with a sucking groan. Beneath it was a narrow brick-lined chamber, no wider than a coffin, and half filled with black water. A smell rose out, cold and sour, carrying rust, marsh gas, and something metallic that made Marion cover her mouth with her sleeve. At the bottom of the chamber, wedged above the waterline on 2 iron brackets, was a tin strongbox. For several seconds, Marion could only stare. Then, the old part of her, the part trained by her mother's lists and Thomas's folders, took command. She lowered herself carefully onto her stomach, reached down, and hooked the handle with the pry bar. The box scraped against brick. It was heavier than she expected. Her shoulders burned. Mud soaked through the front of her dress. Twice the bar slipped and struck the brick with a ringing sound that made her freeze and look toward the road. No one came. At last, with one final pull, the strongbox rose from the chamber and slid onto the bank. It was dark green beneath the mud, sealed with wax along the lid. Around it, Thomas had wrapped 3 lengths of oiled canvas and tied them with the same red thread. Marion carried it back to the shed with both arms locked around it. By the time she reached the workbench, her breath came hard and her knees trembled. She shut the door, lit another candle, and used the hammer to break the wax. Inside was Thomas's final case. Not a single paper, a whole history. The first layer was practical, money, but not treasure. 4 envelopes held cash in small bills, enough to buy food, stovepipe, tar paper, nails, and perhaps a lawyer's first hour. Each envelope was labeled in Thomas's hand. Shelter, food, copies, travel if needed. Marion pressed one hand over her mouth, even while afraid, even while hunted by the truth he had found. Thomas had thought about how she would survive the first weeks. Beneath the envelopes lay a bundle of documents wrapped in wax paper. Deeds, tax maps, transfer forms, bank letters, photographs of signatures enlarged and compared. Some bore names Marion knew: Peter Lyle, Celia Brand, the Kittredges on Marsh Road. Others belonged to families long gone from Harrow's Point. A list sat on top. 23 names. Beside each name was a parcel number, a date, and one word written again and again: taken. Marion read until the letters blurred. This was not one stolen dock right, not one confused boundary, not one grieving widow tricked into signing the wrong paper. It was a pattern stretching back 40 years. The Harrow family had not merely built Harrow's Point. They had fed on it, one quiet transfer at a time. At the bottom of the bundle was a smaller envelope marked M. Marion's fingers stopped. She opened it slowly. Inside was Thomas's wedding ring. She had buried him with what she thought was his ring. Now she understood the one placed on his hand had not been his at all, or had been switched before she saw him. This ring carried the small nick near the edge from the summer he repaired their back steps and struck it against a nail. Folded around, it was a letter. Marion, if you are reading this, the first story they gave you was a lie. She had to set the paper down. The shed tilted. The candle flame doubled, then steadied. She gripped the workbench until the dizziness passed. Then she read on. Thomas wrote that he had followed the old land transfers to Salt Reed Bog because the first forged deed in the chain had begun there, with a cranberry grower named Ruth Bellamy, who had lost her land after refusing to sell to Arthur Harrow in 1968. Ruth had claimed the drainage records would prove her ownership, but she died before anyone listened. Thomas had found those records. He had also found evidence that Arthur Harrow's son, Edmund, had continued the same scheme through the bank, the town clerk's office, and selected sheriff's reports marked accidental, closed, or unfounded. The bog was not poisoned by nature. It had been poisoned deliberately years ago, its channels fouled to drive down the land value and bury the original water records beneath a failed drainage system. Marian looked up from the letter toward the dark window. Dead vines, sour water, black mud, not worthless, silenced. The last pages were photographs. One showed Thomas's bootprints beside the drainage gate. One showed Edmund Harrow's truck near Salt Reed Road on the morning Thomas died. One showed the gate frame, fresh, splintered wood, and something dark on the lower beam. The final photograph made Marian's hands go still. It was Thomas, reflected faintly in the glass of the drainage gauge, holding the camera. Behind him, at the edge of the frame, stood Sheriff Nolan, not miles away at Black Spruce Road. Here, at the bog, on the day Thomas died, Marian did not cry then. The grief was too large for tears. It moved beyond weeping, into a place so quiet she could hear the candle burning. For 27 years, she had sorted Thomas's papers. Now he had left her one last table, one last set of facts, one last pattern that needed a steady hand. The strongbox held material help to keep her alive. It held emotional truth to tell her she had not imagined the fear in his eyes. And it held action, names, documents, photographs, and a path forward that would either restore the dead or bury Marian beside them in another official lie. At the very bottom of the box was a note written on a torn piece of survey paper. Do not take this to Nolan. Find Elias Finch. Make copies first. Trust your notebook. Marian read the last line twice. Trust your notebook. Outside, an engine passed slowly on Salt Reed Road. This time it stopped. Marian blew out the candle, closed the strongbox, and pulled Thomas's hat down from the shelf. She placed the ring inside the hatband, where her fingers could feel it through the felt. Then she took her blue notebook from her coat, opened to a clean page, and began writing everything in order. If you're still here, subscribe for more stories about the people the world underestimated. Marian could not walk away now, because the danger Thomas feared had finally reached her door. By the time the engine outside moved again, Marian had already slid the strongbox beneath the loose boards behind the stove. She had not hidden it well enough for a search. She knew that. But she had hidden it well enough for a neighborly visit. And sometimes danger came first, with a soft knock. The knock landed on the shed door, just after noon. Marian placed the blue notebook inside her coat and opened the door only wide enough to see Sheriff Nolan standing on the broken walkway, with rain shining on his brown jacket. Behind him, near the road, a black truck waited with its engine running. Marian, he said, heard you came out here. You heard correctly. His eyes moved past her into the shed. The stove, the workbench, the patched canvas, Thomas's photograph on the shelf. This isn't a place for a woman alone. It is the place my husband left me. Nolan's mouth tightened at the word husband. I came to check on your welfare. Then you have seen I'm alive. She began to close the door. He put one hand against it. You should be careful, he said. Old bogs are dangerous. A person could step wrong, go under, and not be found for days. Marian looked at his hand on the wood. Is that official advice? It's friendly advice. I have learned to be cautious with friendly things. For a moment, the fog seemed to gather between them. Nolan's face changed only a little, but Marian saw the impatience beneath the concern. Men like him preferred fear when it arrived quickly. Quiet resistance made them uncertain. His gaze lowered to her coat pocket. What's that? My notebook. You always did write too much. No, Marian said. I wrote enough. The sheriff smiled, but there was no warmth in it. If you find anything out here, anything that belonged to Thomas's work, you bring it to me. Evidence belongs with the department. Does it? The question left her mouth before she could soften it. Nolan's smile disappeared. The black truck at the road shifted into gear, then stopped again. A man sat behind the wheel, but the windshield reflected too much gray sky for Marian to see his face. Nolan leaned closer. Grief can confuse a person, he said. It can make patterns where there aren't any. Marion thought of Thomas's ring hidden in the hatband, of the photograph with Nolan standing at the bog on the day Thomas died. My grief has not confused me. Then don't let it make you foolish. He stepped back, looked once toward the west channel, and walked away. Marion kept the door open until his truck disappeared into the fog. Only then did she close it, slide the latch, and write. Nolan came to shed, asked about anything found. Threat implied. Bog accident. Black truck present. Unknown driver. After that, she made copies the only way she could. Not by machine. Not yet. The town copier sat inside the library wing funded by Harrow money. So Marion copied by hand. All afternoon, while rain moved across the roof in silver lines, she transcribed the most important names, parcel numbers, dates, and notes from Thomas's files into her own notebook. Her hand cramped. Her shoulders ached. Still, she wrote, Peter Lyle, doc transfer, signature mismatch, Celia Brand. Bible deed contradicts town record. Ruth Bellamy. Original bog owner, 1,968. Refused sale. Arthur Harrow. Drainage poisoning suspected. Edmund Harrow. Continued transfers through bank. Sheriff Nolan present at Salt Reed Bog on day of TD death. She stopped only when a stone crashed through the shed window. Glass burst across the floor. Marion ducked behind the workbench as the stone struck the opposite wall and dropped beside an old crate. Outside, an engine roared to life. She waited until it faded before moving. The stone had paper tied around it with fishing line. The message was written in block letters. Sell the bog or join your husband. Marion read it once. Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside an envelope. A threat was still a document if one had the sense to keep it. That night, she did not sleep in the open corner of the shed. She moved her blanket behind the workbench, where the wall and crates gave some cover. She kept the hammer in one hand and Thomas's brass key in the other. The stove stayed dark because smoke might show she was awake. Near midnight, footsteps came from the road. Marion opened her eyes in darkness. The steps were slow, careful, stopping whenever the walkway complained. Whoever approached knew the boards were weak. Whoever approached had been here before. A shadow crossed the broken window. The latch lifted once. Marion held her breath. The door did not open. She had wedged the pry bar through the inside handle. The latch lifted again. Then a man's voice whispered from outside. She's got something. Another voice answered. Farther away. Find it tomorrow. Harrow wants the paper before she leaves town. The footsteps retreated. Marion stayed still long after they were gone. Before dawn, she rose, wrapped the strongbox in canvas, and carried it out through the back of the shed. Fog hid her. The marsh swallowed sound. She moved past the west channel to an old clump of bayberry bushes where the ground rose above the water. There, she buried the strongbox beneath roots and stones, marking the place only in her notebook with words no one else would understand. 3 paces from bent cedar, 1 from split stone. Under bitter leaves, she kept only the cash envelope marked copies. Thomas's letter, the photograph of Nolan, and 3 key documents inside her dress beneath her coat. At sunrise, Marion found fresh boot prints near the shed door. Large prints. 2 men. One had a missing heel on the right boot. She knelt and drew them in her notebook before the rain could soften their edges. By mid-morning, Mr. Voss arrived in a clean car that had no business on Salt Reed Road. He did not step into the mud. Mrs. Doyle, he called from the road. Mr. Harrow is prepared to make a generous offer. Marion stood in front of the shed with her coat buttoned to the throat. Yesterday, it was $1. Circumstances change. No, she said. They reveal themselves. Voss looked past her toward the bog, his face pale with irritation. You don't understand what you're holding. Marion thought of the strongbox beneath the bayberry roots. I understand more than I did. His voice hardened. This property carries debts. Environmental liability. Back taxes. You could lose everything. I already did. No. You could lose more. At that, Marion almost smiled. Men like Voss believed fear worked best when attached to possessions, but they had taken her house. They had stained her husband's name. They had left her with a poisoned bog and expected her to feel poor. They did not understand that a woman with nothing left to protect could become very difficult to purchase. "Tell Mr. Harrow," she said, "the bog is not for sale." Voss got back into his car without another word. As he drove away, Marion saw his tires stop briefly near the drainage gate. He was looking for something. That meant they did not know exactly where Thomas had hidden the case. Not yet. Marion waited until the car vanished, then took the envelope marked copies from beneath her coat. Thomas's note had been clear. "Find Elias Finch. Make copies first." The town was dangerous now. The sheriff could not be trusted. The bank was part of it. Harrow already knew enough to be afraid. Marion looked at the broken window, the boot prints, and the road disappearing into fog. Then she went inside, packed the documents close to her body, and prepared to walk back toward the town that wanted her silent. Elias Finch lived above the old print shop on Harbor Lane, in a room that smelled of dust, coffee, and newspaper ink. Marion reached his door just after noon, with Thomas's papers wrapped flat beneath her coat. She had taken the back streets into town, avoiding the bank windows, the sheriff's office, and the polished front of Harrow Real Estate. Every storefront seemed to have eyes. The print shop had been closed for 9 years. Yellowing pages from old editions of the Harrow's Point Ledger covered the front windows. Beneath the dust, Marion saw one headline she remembered: "Local reporter resigns after records dispute." Elias opened the upstairs door with the chains still on. He was thinner than she remembered, with white hair standing in uneven wisps and ink stains along 2 fingers. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "Thomas told me to find you." The chain came off. His room held stacks of newspapers tied with string, boxes labeled by year, and a kitchen table buried beneath clippings. Near the wall sat a small copy machine, old but clean, covered with a blanket. Marion looked at it and nearly lost her balance. "He thought you might need that," Elias said. "Thomas. He came here 3 weeks before he died." Elias cleared the table, and Marion laid out part of Thomas's file. Not all of it. She was careful even now. She kept the photograph of Nolan beneath her coat until Elias showed her his own folder. Inside were clippings about Ruth Bellamy, the woman who had owned Salt Reed Bog before the Harrows wanted it. A widow, a cranberry grower, a woman who had refused to sell. One photograph showed her standing knee-deep in cranberry water, sleeves rolled, chin lifted toward the camera. "She said the drainage records would prove everything," Elias said. "Then she died." "How?" "Fall from the west footbridge during a storm." Marion looked up. Elias did not need to explain. He showed her more clippings. A fisherman drowned after contesting dock rights. A farmer's barn burned before a land hearing. A clerk left town after saying records had been changed. Each story had been printed as accident, illness, relocation, or bad luck. Thomas had been right. One victim was never only one victim. "I had witnesses in 1997, Elias said. 3 of them. By the time the story was ready, one withdrew, one vanished to Bangor, and one changed her statement after her son lost his job. Then Edmund Harrow threatened a libel suit." The paper folded. Marion placed Thomas's letter on the table. Elias read the first line and went still. "If you are reading this, the first story they gave you was a lie." For a while, the room held only the sound of rain against the glass. Then Elias uncovered the copy machine. It started with a cough, a click, and a low hum. To Marion, it sounded like a door opening. They copied until the machine grew hot. Deeds, maps, signature comparisons, Thomas's letter, the list of 23 names, Elias's old clippings. Each page came out warm and faintly curled. Marion stacked them by category the way she had done at her kitchen table for years. Names, dates, land, deaths, officials, proof Thomas had been at the bog. Elias watched her hands move. "He said you were better at this than he was." Marion did not look up. "He was being kind." "No," Elias said. "He was being accurate." By late afternoon, they needed more than paper. They needed people. Not many. Marion would not risk a crowd. But documents carried more weight when tied to living memory. Elias took her first to Peter Lyle, who was cleaning knives in the back room of the fish market. When he saw the copy of his dock transfer, his face tightened. "I never signed that." Would you say it under oath? Marion asked. Peter looked toward the front counter, where his nephew worked. Fear crossed his face. Then, he wiped his hands on a towel. I'm tired of being careful for men who stole from me. He wrote his statement on fish market invoice paper. Next was Celia Brand, the widow with the Bible deed. She listened in her small parlor, then went to her bedroom, and returned with a family Bible wrapped in a pillowcase. Her husband's deed was still inside. I thought I was the fool, Celia said. They made me believe I remembered wrong. Marion touched the edge of the Bible. No. They counted on you being alone. Celia signed a statement in a hand that trembled, but did not stop. The third witness was Ada Mercer, the former town clerk. Elias warned Marion that Ada had refused to talk for years. She saw too much, he said. And her grandson works for Harrow Development. Ada opened the door only after Elias said Thomas's name. She listened from behind the screen, her face pale in the dim hall. When Marion showed her the parcel numbers, Ada closed her eyes. I changed some records, she whispered. Elias went still. Marion did not step closer. Why? Because I was told the originals were wrong. Because Mr. Harrow stood in my office with Sheriff Nolan behind him. Because I had 2 children and no husband, and I was afraid. Her voice broke on the last word. Can you tell the truth now? Marion asked. Ada opened the screen door. I can tell enough. By dusk, Marion had 3 statements. Elias's archive, and copies hidden in 4 places. 1 beneath Elias's floorboard, 1 inside Celia's Bible, 1 in Peter's freezer wrapped in butcher paper, and 1 inside Marion's coat. But the most important copy she carried to the post office herself. Elias gave her the address of a federal marshal in Portland who had once investigated land fraud along the coast. Thomas had written the man's name in the margin of 1 file, but had not lived long enough to send the package. At the postal counter, Marion watched the clerk weigh the envelope. Her hands were muddy at the nails. Her black dress was creased from sleeping in the shed. Her face in the small mirror behind the counter looked older than it had a week ago. But when the clerk asked if she wanted tracking, Marion heard her mother's voice. Every promise should be written down. Yes, Marion said. She paid with cash from Thomas's envelope and placed the receipt in her blue notebook. Outside, evening settled over Harrow's Point. Lights came on in the bank, the sheriff's office, and the Harrow house on the hill. Marion was still afraid, but fear had changed shape. It was no longer a wall in front of her. It was wind at her back. The summons came 2 mornings later. A young deputy Marion did not know found her at the edge of the bog, where she was clearing dead vines from the West Channel with a repaired rake. Mrs. Doyle, he said, holding out a folded paper. Marion wiped her hands before taking it. The hearing would be held that afternoon at Town Hall. Emergency review of hazardous property. Environmental liability. Public safety concern. Possible seizure of Salt Reed Bog. She read it twice. The words were dressed as law, but she recognized the body beneath them. They had not found the strongbox. They had not stopped the package. So now they would try to take the land itself. Did Sheriff Nolan send you? She asked. The deputy looked toward the road. He told me to make sure you received it. Then tell him I did. The boy hesitated. My father used to fish from Peter Lyle's dock. Then he turned away before she could answer. Marion stood with the paper in her hand and the gray morning pressing low over the bog. A hearing was not a visit at the shed door. It was a room full of people, polished shoes, careful words, and questions meant to turn grief into weakness. She looked toward the bayberry bushes where the strongbox lay buried. Then she walked back to the shed. By noon, Marion had washed her hands in rainwater, pinned her hair, and changed into the cleanest dress she owned, dark blue instead of black. She placed Thomas's ring in her pocket, slid the photograph of Nolan at the bog inside her notebook, and tied the copies in brown paper. Before leaving, she stood in front of Thomas's photograph. I am not as brave as you were, she said. The picture did not answer. Marion picked up her notebook. But I am still going. Town Hall smelled of wet wool, old varnish, and coal heat. Every bench was full. Fishermen stood along the back wall. Bank clerks whispered near the side door. Mrs. Harrow sat in the front row with her gloves folded neatly over a handbag. Edmund Harrow stood beside Mr. Voss near the council table, silver hair smooth, coat immaculate, expression mild. Sheriff Nolan leaned against the wall by the door. He did not look at Marion when she entered. That told her he had either seen the marshal's envelope leave town or feared that he had. At the center table sat 3 councilmen and Judge Alton Pierce, retired for 6 years, but always present when Harrow business required an old legal voice. Mr. Voss spoke first. Salt Reed Bog, he said, was failed land with dangerous structures, environmental concerns, unpaid obligations, and no competent management. Mrs. Doyle, recently bereaved, was in no condition to carry such liability. Harrow Development had offered to assume responsibility at personal financial loss for the good of the town. Edmund lowered his eyes with practiced humility. Then Judge Pierce looked at Marion. Mrs. Doyle, do you understand the matter before us? Marion stood. I understand that men who offered me $1 for my land now claim they want it for public safety. A few people shifted. Voss's face tightened. Judge Pierce frowned. This is not a place for accusations. Then it should not be a place for theft. The room went quiet enough for rain to be heard against the windows. Edmund raised one gentle hand. Mrs. Doyle is grieving. We all understand that grief can make a person suspicious. Marion turned toward him. No. Grief made me tired. Your paperwork made me suspicious. A breath moved through the back benches. Voss opened a folder. Mrs. Doyle has no experience managing cranberry land, drainage systems, environmental repair, or legal claims attached to such property. That is true, Marion said. He seemed pleased. Then she added, but I have experience reading dates. She untied the brown paper bundle and placed the first copies on the table. These transfers involve land near Salt Reed Road, Marsh Road, and the Old Harbor Slips. 23 parcels, all taken from widows, fishermen, aging farmers, or families without lawyers. The signatures change, but the witnesses repeat. The bank officer repeats. The town clerk's stamp repeats. And Harrow Development appears after each transfer. Judge Pierce leaned forward. Where did you get these? My husband gathered some. Elias Finch gathered others. The rest came from public records. At the mention of Elias, heads turned. Elias stood at the back beside Peter Lyle, one hand resting on a cane. Voss said, These are unsupported fragments. Peter stepped forward. That one is mine, he said, pointing to a page. I never signed my doc away. Judge Pierce's mouth tightened. Mr. Lyle, you are not called. I've been waiting 20 years to be called. A murmur moved through the hall. Celia Brand rose next, holding her family Bible against her chest. My husband's deed is still in this Bible, she said. The town record is not the same paper. Mrs. Harrow looked down at her gloves. Then Ada Mercer stood near the side aisle, pale but upright. I changed records, she said. The room seemed to tilt. Edmund's face did not move, but Marion saw his fingers curl once against his palm. Judge Pierce stared at Ada. Mrs. Mercer, I advise caution. I have lived cautiously for 30 years, Ada said. It did not make me clean. Marion placed another page on the table. This is Ruth Bellamy. She owned Salt Reed Bog before the Harrow family wanted it. She said drainage records would prove her ownership. Then she died before a hearing. The bog was later declared ruined. My husband found evidence the drainage system was deliberately fouled. That is absurd, Voss snapped. Marion looked at him. Then you will welcome an independent investigation. For the first time, Edmund spoke without softness. You are a widow living in a shed, Mrs. Doyle. You have no money, no legal training, and no understanding of what you are challenging. There it was. Not the polite mask. The belief beneath it. Marion touched Thomas's ring in her pocket. You can question my education, she said. You cannot change the facts. Sheriff Nolan pushed away from the wall. This has gone far enough. If Mrs. Doyle is holding evidence from an official investigation, it belongs with my office. Marion opened her notebook to the photograph and laid it flat. In the image, Thomas's reflection showed in the drainage gauge. Behind him stood Sheriff Nolan at Salt Reed Bog. Then explain why you were at the bog on the day my husband died, Marion said, when your report says he died alone in the woods beyond Black Spruce Road. Nolan's face lost color. Someone gasped. Judge Pierce reached for the photograph, but Marion kept one finger on its edge. "This is a copy," she said. "The original is safe." Edmund looked toward Nolan once, and the room saw it. Voss rose. "This is highly improper." The doors at the back opened. Two men entered in dark coats, followed by the young deputy who had delivered Marion's summons. One of the men removed his hat and held up a badge. "Federal Marshal Daniel Reeves," he said. "I'm looking for Marion Doyle." No one spoke. Marion lifted her hand. The marshal walked down the aisle as the town seemed to part around him. "We received your package," he said. "Are you willing to provide a sworn statement and identify the location of the remaining evidence?" Edmund stepped forward. "This is a local civil matter." Marshal Reeves looked at him. "Not anymore." The words landed harder than any shout. For a moment, Marion saw the town as Thomas must have seen it, not as one great evil, but as many frightened silences fastened together. Peter with his ruined dock, Celia with her Bible deed, Ada with 30 years of shame, the deputy whose father had lost a place to fish, Elias with old headlines yellowing in a dead print shop, and herself, standing in a dress still smelling faintly of smoke and bog water, holding the facts her husband had died to save. Judge Pierce tried to restore order, but the order had already broken. Marshal Reeves asked Sheriff Nolan to remain in the room. Another agent took Mr. Voss's folder. The young deputy moved quietly to the door, not blocking Marion, but blocking anyone who might leave too quickly. Edmund looked at Marion with open hatred now. "You have no idea what this will cost," he said. Marion thought of Gull Street, the lavender by the steps, Thomas in the ground, Ruth Bellamy in the mud of history, and 23 names marked taken. "Yes," she said, "I do." Then she turned to the marshal. "The rest is at the bog," she said. "But I will show you only after copies are placed somewhere no Harrow hand can reach." For the first time that day, Marshal Reeves smiled slightly. "That," he said, "is a reasonable condition." Outside, rain kept falling on Harrow's Point. It ran down the town hall windows, along the curb, into the gutters, toward the harbor and the marsh beyond. For years, water had carried the town's secrets downward. Now, finally, it was bringing them back. The investigation did not end that afternoon. Truth, Marion learned, did not move like lightning. It moved like tidewater, slow, patient, unavoidable once it had found a channel. Federal marshals came to Salt Reed Bog before sunset with cameras, evidence bags, and boots high enough for the mud. Marion led them past the shed, past the west channel, past the drainage gate where Thomas had carved his initials into the wood. She showed them the hidden hatch below the spillway. She showed them where the strongbox had been taken from the brick chamber. She showed them the bayberry bushes where she had buried what remained. Marshal Reeves did not touch anything until it had been photographed. Marion appreciated that. For the first time since Thomas died, someone treated the truth as something fragile enough to protect. By nightfall, the bog was no longer a joke whispered about in town. It was a federal crime scene. Yellow markers stood near the drainage gate. Men in dark coats measured the bullet-scarred frame. One agent scraped residue from the old wooden beams. Another photographed the poisoned water channels and the false coverboards Thomas had discovered before he died. Marion stood near the shed with Thomas's hat in both hands. Marshal Reeves came to her just before dark. "Mrs. Doyle," he said, "your husband was right." She closed her eyes. It was not comfort. Not exactly. Nothing could return Thomas to the kitchen table, to the porch steps, to the lavender by the door. But the words gave shape to what grief had known before evidence could prove it. Thomas had not been reckless. He had not been careless. He had not wandered into the woods and died by accident. He had been following the truth, and the truth had followed him back to the bog. Within 2 weeks, Sheriff Nolan was suspended. Mr. Voss was removed from North Coast Bank pending investigation. Edmund Harrow's accounts were frozen after federal agents found duplicate deed files in a locked cabinet beneath his private office. The town changed in layers. At first, people lowered their voices when Marion passed. Then they began bringing things. Peter Lyle brought coffee in a dented thermos and a written statement from 2 other fishermen. Celia Brand brought a quilt for the shed. Ada Mercer brought 3 boxes of old clerk records she had hidden in her attic. each one tied with string and shame. Even the young deputy came one morning with a hammer, nails, and his father's old hip boots. "Thought the west walkway could use fixing," he said. Marion looked at him for a long moment. Then she handed him a board. The courtroom hearing came in Portland 6 months later, after winter had hardened the bog and spring had begun loosening it again. Marion wore the dark blue dress, not black. She carried her blue notebook in her purse, Thomas's ring on a chain beneath her collar, and copies of every document arranged in the order she had made at the kitchen table. The opposing attorney tried to make her small. He asked about her education, high school, her legal training. None. Her emotional state after her husband's death. Grieving. Her experience with land records. 27 years of helping my husband read what powerful men hoped ordinary people would not understand, Marion said. A few people in the courtroom shifted. The attorney asked if she hated the Harrow family. Marion looked at Edmund Harrow sitting at the defense table. Older now somehow. His fine coat unable to cover the fear in his shoulders. "No," she said. "Hate would have made me careless." Then she opened her notebook. Dates. Weather. Names. Vehicles. Warnings. Threats. The day Thomas came home with mud on his knees. The black truck. Sheriff Nolan's visit. Mr. Voss's offer. The stone through the window. The boot prints with the missing heel. One by one, the things people had dismissed as a widow's grief became a pattern no one could laugh away. The court did not repair everything in a single day. No court could. But it ordered a full review of the disputed land transfers. It froze Harrow Development's claims to Salt Reed Bog. It referred criminal charges connected to fraud, intimidation, evidence tampering, and Thomas Doyle's death. It reopened the deaths of Ruth Bellamy and 2 others marked accidental. Most of all, it placed the bog under Marion's legal protection until the investigation was complete. When the judge asked whether she wished to sell the property after environmental assessment, the room became very still. Edmund Harrow did not look at her. Mr. Voss looked at the table. Sheriff Nolan, brought in under guard for testimony, stared at the floor. Marion stood with both hands resting on the rail. "No," she said. The judge looked over his glasses. "No?" "No, Your Honor. I intend to restore it." The answer moved quietly through the courtroom. Not dramatic, not triumphant, but final. Outside, on the courthouse steps, reporters called her name. Elias stood nearby, smiling for the first time since Marion had known him. Peter and Celia waited beside him. Ada held a handkerchief to her mouth. Marshal Reeves returned Thomas's original ring to Marion in a small evidence envelope. She took it carefully. For a moment, the courthouse, the reporters, the questions, and the cold spring wind all disappeared. There was only a gold ring in her palm, marked by one small nick from a summer long ago. Marion closed her fingers around it. Then she turned away from the cameras and went home to the bog. Restoring Salt Reed Bog took longer than winning the right to keep it. Victory had sounded clean in the courtroom. Restoration was not clean at all. It was mud under Marion's fingernails, rain down the back of her collar, bills spread across the shed table, and mornings when the work looked larger than her body could carry. Federal investigators came and went. Environmental men tested the water. Old drainage diagrams were unfolded, corrected, and folded again. The bog had been hurt on purpose, but it could not be healed by anger. It needed labor. So Marion worked. She learned the names of channels and beds, of vines and rot, of flooding and draining. She learned which boards could be reused and which had to be burned. She learned that cranberry roots were stubborn in a way that reminded her of old women who had survived more winters than anyone expected. Some vines were dead. Some only looked dead. That difference mattered. Peter came on Saturdays to repair the west walkway. The young deputy, Samuel, came after shifts with tools in the back of his truck. Celia brought soup in jars and never asked for the jars back. Ada organized old records into boxes labeled by year, her handwriting growing steadier each week. Elias wrote again. His first article ran in a Portland paper under the headline, "The Bog That Kept the Records." He wrote about Thomas, Ruth Bellamy, the fishermen, the widows, and the quiet way land could be stolen when people were taught to feel ashamed of not understanding the papers placed before them. After the article, letters began to come. Some came from families who had left Harrow's Point decades earlier. Some came from sons and daughters who had heard old stories about a lost farm, a missing dock, a deed that changed after a funeral. Marian answered each one slowly at night, beside the stove, using the careful hand that had labeled Thomas's folders. She did not promise miracles. She promised only that their names would not be thrown away. By late summer, the first clear water moved through the West Channel. Marian stood with her boots sunk in the bank and watched it happen. It was not dramatic. No crowd gathered. A gate opened, a blockage shifted, and a thin brown current began to run where water had sat trapped for years. It carried leaves, silt, and old rust. Then, beneath that, something cleaner followed. Marian crouched and touched 2 fingers to the stream. Cold, moving, alive. She thought of Thomas at their kitchen table, moving dates into order. She thought of Ruth Bellamy, standing in old photographs, with cranberry water around her knees. She thought of her mother pulling a receipt from a recipe book while a bankman lost his smile. Paper could stop a lie. Water could remember a path. And a woman, if she stayed, could learn the difference between a dead thing and a thing waiting for care. The house on Gull Street was eventually returned to her. The bank called it a corrected filing. Marian called it what it was, but not loudly. She walked through the front door one clear September morning and found dust on the blue pantry shelves, dead flies on the windowsills, and lavender by the steps gone woody and wild. For a while, she only stood there. The house still held her shape. Her cup on the second shelf, the worn place where Thomas's chair had stood, the hook where his coat used to hang. But she did not move back. Not fully. She cleaned it, opened the windows, cut the lavender, placed fresh curtains in the kitchen. Then she gave the key to Celia Brand for the winter, because Celia's roof needed repairs, and no widow should have to choose between pride and warmth. Marian returned to the bog before dusk. The shed was no longer only a shed. It had a patched roof, a level table, shelves for records, and a small iron stove that no longer smoked into the room. On the wall hung a framed copy of Ruth Bellamy's original deed. Beneath it, Marian had placed Thomas's deputy hat on a narrow wooden shelf, not as a relic, as a witness. The first good cranberry harvest came the following year, small but real. The berries were not enough to make anyone rich. That was never the point. They floated bright red in the flooded bed, like pieces of sunrise gathered in water. People from town came to help gather them. Some came because they were sorry. Some came because they were curious. Some came because, for the first time in years, Harrow's Point had a place where nobody had to lower their voice before telling the truth. Marian stood at the edge of the bed, older, leaner, her hands rough from work. Around her, baskets filled slowly. Samuel laughed when he slipped knee-deep into the water. Peter cursed at a broken rake. Celia passed coffee along the walkway. Ada sat near the shed with a ledger open, writing down every crate by weight and name. Elias took one photograph. Marian did not smile for it at first. Then she saw the water behind her, clear enough to reflect the sky. She smiled a little. That evening, after everyone left, Marian walked alone to the drainage gate. The bullet scar remained in the wood. She had refused to replace that beam. Some marks, she believed, should stay visible so people remembered what silence had cost. Inside the shed, she set Thomas's ring beside his hat. "I kept it," she said softly. Outside, the bog answered in small sounds. Water moving through channels. Reeds brushing in the wind. A night bird calling from the marsh. Marian opened her blue notebook to a clean page. For the first time since Thomas died, she did not write a threat, a date, a license plate, or a warning. She wrote a name, Ruth Bellamy, then another, Thomas Doyle, then Peter Lyle, Celia Brand, Ada Mercer, and the 23 families marked taken. At the bottom of the page, she wrote her own, Marian Doyle, not because it had been lost, because now she knew where it belonged. The world had called the bog poisoned. The world had called Marian a widow, with nothing left. But the place had held the truth beneath its mud, waiting for someone patient enough to kneel in the cold water and listen. And in giving that truth back to the living, Saltreed Bog had given Marian more than land. It had given her a name that no one else could sign away. If Marian's story moved you, Subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to remember this. A broken beginning does not mean a broken life.